Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
You know, Sugi, if I took this shirt off, you'd see a beautiful, beautiful person.
What the hell? What the
My
hell?
fingers are long and beautiful, as are the other parts of my body.
No, you have to explain yourself, or this is going to be the shortest episode in history.
I went to the Creators for Harris website for something called the Weird Button. It feeds you wackadoodle Vance and Trump quotes. Trump said this shirt thing earlier this year, and he said the beautiful fingers thing back in 2011.
2011. So how is the degree of batshittery not completely evident to us by 2016? You'd think people would already know, right? But they didn't. And maybe they still don't, because the mainstream corporate media does not explicitly say that Trump is kind of unhinged.
Which brings us to our word and topic for today, which is sanewashing has burst onto the media landscape as a thing. And we're going to talk about how Trump news gets sanitized by the old standbys like the Associated Press, CNN, CBS, ABC, NPR, and yes, even MSNBC, and how this sanewashing has provided a lane for a whole new anti-Trump independent media universe. Places like The Bulwark or Brian Tyler Cohen or the MeidasTouch Network, who report on Trump much more aggressively.
And to do that, we're joined by nonfiction writer Jeff Sharlet. Sharlet is the New York Times bestselling author or editor of 8 books. His most recent is The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War, which came out in 2023, the National Book Critics Circle Award finalist for nonfiction, one of the New York Times 100 Books of the Year, and a New Republic Book of the Year. In 2020, he published This Brilliant Darkness, a book of strangers. Sharlet's other books include Sweet Heaven When I Die, C Street, The Family, which was the basis for a 2019 Netflix documentary series. His writing on Russia's anti-LGBTQ crusade earned him the National Magazine Award for reporting, and his writing on anti-LGBT campaigns in Uganda earned the Molly Ivins Prize and the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission's Outspoken Award, among others. Jeff's work has appeared in VQR, Vanity Fair, Harper's, Rolling Stone, the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Esquire, Mother Jones, Bookforum, and many others. Jeff is a longtime fan of your work. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the show. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Suki. It's so good to join you both.
Thanks. Also, I will say thank you too. So look, here we are. Parker Molloy, who writes for the New Republic, coined a word for how the media papers over the true nature of what Trump says and does. Sanewashing. She writes, while speaking at an event put on by the extremist group Moms for Liberty, Trump spread a baseless conspiracy theory that, quote, your kid goes to school and comes home a few days later with an operation, referring to transition-related surgeries for trans people. In the write-up the event, a glowing piece about how Trump charmed this group of conservative moms, the Times didn't even mention the moment when he blathered on and on about a crazy conspiracy that has and will never happen. She has tons of other examples of this. Can you talk about this term and the mainstream media's sanewashing of Trump?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting term, and I'm an admirer of Parker's work. And on the one hand, I'm so grateful for this term, and on the other hand, I disagree with it. And I think I would like to sort of propose a different way. I mean, in the sense I disagree with it, I started covering Trump rallies for the first was in Youngstown, Ohio, in 2016, and an editor I'd worked with for a long time who knew that I often write about sort of varieties of religious experience that, the obvious, go to a Trump rally and report it as a religious meeting. And so I did, on the condition that I was like, I'm not going to get a press pass. I've been doing journalism for 30 years without a press pass. I'm not going to break my perfect record. I just went and waited in line for 8 hours and walked in. And when I talk to people, I'd say, this is what I'm doing. I'm a writer. But it was astonishing because the press at a Trump rally there's a metal pen in the middle of the arena. And it's very much, what's that wrestling term? Is it kayfabe? That kind of theater of wrestling, because there'll be a moment at every rally where Trump will say, "Look at those scum," and everyone turns around and they fly the bird, and it's very cathartic for them, and so on. And the press stays in that metal pen. And at this rally in Youngstown, I've been writing about religion for years and years. I hear one of the hardest right preachers I've ever heard. And I've been to a lot of far right churches. Um, and the crowd who are not churchgoers are eating it up. They like, this is what Christian nationalism really is. It's not so much about going to church, it's about this idea of a mythic Christian nation. And what's the press doing? You know, texting, tapping on the phone. This isn't the main event. Um, and that was my first clue. And that there was a few things going on. The religiosity, this was before everyone said, how can such a, a profane man win? And I'm like, oh, this guy is going to win the religious right vote. And don't listen to the Christian right warlords who are all tied into the establishment. Pay attention to ordinary people. And so there's a sanewashing there, right? We're just sort of saying he's not religious. There's no religious appeal. Um, there was there was all kinds of sanewashing, avoiding the fact that in Youngstown, Ohio, a big part of that crowd really were Democrats. That was a real thing. They were Democrats who voted for Obama and were now going to vote for Trump. Well, that sanewashing also discarded that. And that was something liberals wanted to discard, right? I'm not both siding. I'm just saying what was there. And most of all was the performativity of a Trump rally. And this goes on to this day. Trump does skits. A great way to understand Trump is to watch a rally, turn the volume down. And if you've never seen Lenny Bruce or go back a little further, Borscht Belt comedian, that's what he's doing. It's the timing of an insult comic. It's not Mussolini. It's sharp and it's edgy and it's mean, right? And so if you then turn the sound on and say these words don't make exact sense, you are missing the meaning. And so that's my concern with sanewashing. And again, great respect for Parker's work and think they're one of the few who is sort of reaching out of this, but I think there's a great reassurance narrative going on right now, right? So on the one hand, we have fascism in the shape of Trump. On the other hand, we have this sort of media which believes that the center will still hold. And then we have left and liberals saying, well, if only the press would tell the truth about how crazy Trump is, how he makes no sense, how he's deteriorating. If only they would tell the truth. Well, no, the press isn't doing a good job. Um, but and they are sort of trying to fit it into a centrist narrative. Um, uh, but sanewashing implies that there is no meaning or storytelling or meaning making or logic. And if that was the case, this movement wouldn't be as powerful. The logic is fascist, and it's a dream politic, a nightmare politic, but it
So
is
you're
there.
saying basically like sanewashing is happening, but it doesn't matter. It won't change what's happening with Trump's audience, basically.
Well, I think
Well,
People aren't
and
going to
you're
suddenly be
well,
converted by,
no, wait, I
hearing
think
things
wait,
differently.
you're actually saying that it's not like that sanewashing is casting it as purely insanity and that's not correct.
Yeah, I mean that valuable piece by Parker, which I recommend everyone read, and I think Parker and I are probably more in agreement than the entire New York Times and Washington Post combined, right? But speaking about Trump's incoherent ramblings, this is a reassurance narrative that we've been telling ourselves. It's like this guy makes no sense. Listen to him. He's talking about sharks. Come on, we're writers. Go and listen to the stories. I'm always thinking of the popular misreading of that famous Joan Didion line from the White Album. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. And to me, the worst sin of centrist liberalism was to recast that line as wondrous and powerful and great. And you read the rest of the paragraph in the White Album, and Joan Didion doesn't mean it positively. Joan Didion doesn't mean anything positively. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We tell ourselves, maybe we told ourselves that Biden's just fine. And maybe we tell ourselves that Trump's really, you know what? It's just AstroTurf. I mean, I've been covering Trump for 8 years. It's never stopped. You come back from a rally and people insist that the people that I spent time with were paid actors, or that they weren't there. That's a reassurance narrative. So sanewashing, telling the problem there is the opposite of sane is insane. And there's the implication that we don't have to worry about that, right? If it's incoherent, it's not a threat. And if the people just knew it was incoherent, leaving aside that the New York Times, Trump likes to call it the failing New York Times, is not failing, but it is not the center of power it once was. The New York Times doing the most brilliant, fantastic, everyday reporting it possibly could. I don't think that's going to move the needle that much, because you now may vote against Trump with more knowledge of why you're doing it, but your vote hasn't changed.
That's really interesting. So for our listeners, if you look at Jeff's book, The Undertow, there is like a fantastic description of this skit-based Trump performance in the section. I think it's the part called The First Campaign. And there's this kind of, this close reading of Trump's behavior. So it's interesting because it's a sort of suggests that sanewashing is like an inadequate term, because it doesn't actually, it suggests that you don't have to argue back.
Here, let me say, I think Parker would agree with this. It's fascist washing. And it's and the way that this in the book I call it the F word, because in an earlier book, 2008, I wrote about called The Family. I wrote about a movement that Christian nationalist movement that explicitly looks to Hitler as a model for understanding Jesus. They add in Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Mao, their common denominator, strength and power. After World War II, they actually recruited Nazi war criminals to advise U.S. congressmen, men who were not even allowed in the United States. So they flew those members of Congress over to Germany for that, right? But they weren't fascist, because fascism is a term that means something. And a book that I recommend to everyone is a kind of very accessible primer is Robert O. Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism. He's a historian of Vichy France, and he's talking about European fascism in the 1930s. And people say it's not like Germany in 1936. And I'm like, no, United States in 2024 is not like. You're right. Time and space are real. It's different, but it's that F word, right? And I had at the time said, I don't think fascism of that sort is possible, because fundamentalism will never switch out. American fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism will never switch out. We'll never have that cult of personality. Jesus is too central to a lot of people, including the American right. Obviously, I was wrong. And I got into this with a New York Times reporter who, a senior political reporter who was really scolding me. And this happened just the other day, actually. A senior centrist, center-left Washington Post columnist was scolding me for using the F word. And they're saying, you just can't call people bad names. And I'm like, I'm not calling people bad names. I'm talking about an ideology, a politics, an aesthetic, and we can use those. We can say, okay, how does this meet that? What I found in both cases was that Timesman and that Washington Post columnist, they seemed to have cut themselves off from knowing what fascism meant. Fascism was a dirty word. It's just a word you can never use. To them, it was like the N word. It was just a word you can never use. It was just abject. Instead of saying, my answer is like, well, what about all the people I meet who call themselves fascists? Should I tell them that they're not allowed to call themselves fascists?
Well, I guess I would argue that, the way that I thought of sanewashing, or have been thinking of the sanewashing until we started having this conversation, was that part of that is the refusal to call Trump's movement fascist, refusal to say that word. And, your argument with the Times person who I read about and who Rick Perlstein has written about, to me is an example of your insistence on calling and using the word fascist to talk about this movement is a way of like being honest about what's there that the mainstream media won't do. Anyway, so that to me is just a way of thinking about that. I don't know if you buy that or not. I'm going to transfer on. I want to talk a little bit about these new, some of these new media outlets like MeidasTouch and Brian Taylor Cohen, who are mostly based on YouTube, and they're getting tremendous amount of audience, like at least for media today. Meidas says it's the fastest growing independent news network in the world. Cohen was the first YouTube podcaster to interview President Biden. He has like 3.3 million subscribers. They were credentialed at the DNC, which is kind of a big deal, pissed off some mainstream media people. I feel like they've acquired a lot of this attention because they will call Trump fascist, because they are sort of more direct. in the way that they are criticizing him. But I wonder what you think about if that's why you see the rise, or are they comfort narratives instead, actually, you know?
I mean, we all need some comfort food. Is what I would say. I do. I mean, look, I don't actually understand myself. I certainly don't understand myself as an electoral politics journalist, and not really ultimately as a political journalist. It's not. So I don't know. Is this good politics? Is this bad politics? Is this going to help beat Trump? Is this going to help elect a Democrat? I don't know. Right. That's for people who do that kind of a different kind of and very valuable wonkery. I think uh, it certainly obviously is organizing people, and I think, and we can we can throw in the Lincoln Project for some plays
Yeah,
that
the
function.
Bulwark. I listened to the
Yeah,
Bulwark.
exactly. Um, uh, there's a couple things I would sort of point out, and I think they are part of this sort of larger malaise that I think of as the Trumpocene, right? The age of Trump is a term I borrow from my colleague here, Jeff Ruoff, filmmaker. Um, and if we think of the Trumpocene as not just when Trump is in power, but when there's a certain political aesthetic, and the way that many historians will say the age of Reagan really stretches from 1980. Some will date it even earlier, 1980 to 2016. And you say, how can that be? We had Democrats and so on. But Reaganism was defining both an aesthetics of expression and also an imagination of political possibility. In the Trumpocene, we are I don't want to get in the debate about whether the weird thing was good or not, but that's the Trumpocene, right? That's I'm gonna take on my enemy by throwing a punch. I think the great Susan Faludi has a column in the New York Times today saying Kamala Harris is turning Trump's tactics on him, right? Well, we're in the Trumpocene. We're using Trump rhetorical narratives, and I see that MeidasTouch and some of those folks doing that. And I think that's probably effective electoral politics. I would like to make the distinction, and I don't even mean this in any negative way. MeidasTouch doesn't really do a lot of reporting. It does almost no reporting. It talks about what's on. It's a kind of a closed loop of media, right? And there's something very dangerous that happens there, which is it makes the story always national all the time, which is a way of projecting anxiety and concerns of us, the elites, relatively speaking, right? People who feel like they have agency over the national conversation, and it nationalizes every conflict and obscuring and drawing people away from the daily struggle and their communities, understanding. And that's all happening at the same time as the collapse of local media. Um, and I would say, I mean, this is a weird thing. Like if you go and you look at that conversation with the Timesman, it was odd because he just came in loaded to bear. How dare you talk about fascist Charlotte? I don't like what you do in your book, and I didn't read your book, and I'm not going to read your book. It was very strange. And I was saying, but I think people should subscribe to the New York Times. I can't stand the New York Times, but the one thing that they're right about is the New York Times, like when you talk about those things where they're going to go through thousands and thousands of documents, or a reporting feat that just blew my mind recently, the New Yorker podcast In the Dark on the Haditha massacre of 2005, 24 Iraqi civilians killed by Marines who are still amongst us, never a day in jail. It took 4 years of deep reporting. It's not a take. It's deep, hard, heavy lifting. There's that work. And then there's the work also of MeidasTouch and these other things. Look, you're producing for YouTube constantly. This is fine. That has a place. You don't have time to do the work the journalists like me get to do, which is just to wander around, to linger. And what lingering might have once been called beat journalism, but we're losing that, right? You have a beat. So I think they're valuable, but I do think if a person has switched out all their news gathering to those, at the very least, they should be aware. And they should also, if they're not going to subscribe to something, I can't believe this is like telling people to subscribe to New York Times. You should send MeidasTouch money if you're gonna do that news. There needs to be resources. Reporting is expensive, and Sugi, I know you've done journalism. It costs money and time. So
Yeah. I really appreciate this point about local journalism. I was like my early chops are as a local journalist. Like Whitney also worked as a journalist.
Oh, you did.
Whitney,
Okay.
I'm curious about whether you are paying for MeidasTouch stuff or not. We were having when we were preparing for this episode, it was making not so gentle fun of me for kind of not knowing what he was talking about because I'm such a print journalist that I like consume very little broadcast media.
God bless you. You're saving America. I mean,
I
that's
mean either that but or I'm really out of it, right? But like it seems to me like one of the things that's kind of under what you're saying about using the F word, saying people are fascist, is like the notion, it's kind of like, right, think about the word terrorist or terrorism, right? Like I write in particular relation to that word, and the implication of the word terrorist is that like you can't stand next to that person, you can't talk to that person, you can't be in conversation with them. Like the second that they're called that, you can't engage with them, or it's an immoral thing to engage with them. And there's like some way in which that seems to have transferred over to the use of the word fascism. Like if you've called someone a fascist, then you can't talk to them. But that's not how you use it, because
no.
you call it fascism and then you go to the rally, right? Like, and you go to the rally without a press pass. So you're not in the pen, you're standing next to them. And like a lot of what your book does is to depict the people who are engaged in those movements. So not only are you using the word, but you're not using the word to disengage. And it seems to me like there's something unspoken in other people's reluctance to use it. And like that they're like, but we should still be talking to these people. And I'm like, but you still can. They're actual models of that. Right. And I don't know, like it's interesting to think about the MeidasTouch as like a closed loop that's not doing any reporting, because that also, I mean, to your point about changing the aesthetics of journalism, does that make it like a like a Trump aesthetic, but left wing, like Columbia Journalism Review of, I mean, is it like an alternative to CJR as opposed to like an alternative to actually the Times? Or I don't know, but I like one of the
I
things
mean,
I
I
so
brought
appreciate.
this up because I listen to them all the time now, and
No,
I
and
got
I think
Are
very
you
that's
are you
tired.
paying for them? Are you paying
No,
for
of
it?
course not. It's free on YouTube. I pay for it
nothing
by
is free.
letting their commercials run while I'm listening
Yeah.
to it, you know.
Well,
But
but that's a bad that's a kind of a dangerous model, right?
what do you mean?
So
Um, Free journalism is kind of a dangerous model.
yeah,
It obscures how much it costs to make, and two, it transfers those costs to sponsors, right?
Right.
And this is like we see the danger of that most clearly in Fox News, which if you follow MeidasTouch, you're probably familiar with. Fox News doesn't need cable subscribers or I'm sorry, they don't need advertisers anymore. And I listen to a lot of right-wing media, and when I'm driving around, I sometimes switch in the car. I'll listen to like the CNN and so on commercial every so many minutes. Fox will just run and run and run and run. They don't need commercials. Um, um, Partly because they do have that power. And I would like us, the non-Fox News world, to have the power, democracy now, except on a larger scale, for subscriber-based news. And obviously, not everyone can afford that, but I think it also puts MeidasTouch in a really uncomfortable relationship with the Democratic Party. I was looking at the website today, and it's got, um, they're pushing back against the false narrative of no money for North Carolina because of migrants. Complete false lie. They're doing the work there, right? They're doing important work and
Hmm.
doing it better than the newspapers are. But then they're flipping it and saying, in fact, everything's great and the government to the rescue. And that's not the case. That's not the on the ground case that we see from the local reporters. And their accompanying it reminded me they have a familiar picture of Biden with his aviators looking good. And it reminded me years ago, my first job in journalism was at a little outfit that was also producing the paper for the AFL-CIO back in the very old business unionism corrupt Lane Kirkland days. And every article in the paper had the same picture of Lane Kirkland, the corrupt president of the AFL-CIO. And every article was about everything's looking up. And this was at a time when labor was in real deep trouble. So I think those kinds of relationships are too close and too messy, and they take us away from. See, that's what I agree with you, Sugi. They take us away from reading, and that slow process, but that's probably we writers should just give
I
it
don't
up.
have time to read
I
anymore.
know, I know, I
What is
know.
going on? These things have to happen on my phone while I'm driving to soccer practice.
Yeah,
Can't read
yeah,
while I'm driving. Anyway,
yeah.
I know what you're saying. I mean, for instance, I do appreciate some of the things that MeidasTouch and Brian Tyler Cohen and other YouTubers like that do because they are more direct than CNN. I cannot listen to CNN's
Oh, it's
like
terrible, but
clips.
you have to listen to it as an artifact, as a cultural
Okay, I
text.
don't want to.
The same way
Somebody
you
else can
listen to
do
Fox
that.
News or, I mean, not everyone does this. I mean, I started listening to right-wing media, I think, in 2001. And and actually, Suga, you said the word terrorist, right? And I was sort of thinking, I remember I was in Wheaton, Illinois, on the campus of a Christian conservative college called Wheaton, and I was working in their archives. And so I was surrounded in this sort of very conservative community and so on. And the drumbeat was coming up for the war, uh, and uh, and so I started listening to all that right-wing media and becoming really fascinating. The thing that's always interesting to me, and this goes back even earlier, I'd listened to Howard Stern in the 90s. It's weird how Howard Stern has suddenly become this sort of liberal icon. And, I learned on MeidasTouch that hooray, Howard and Kamala are going to be talking. I mean, he was the villain of the 90s. And I would listen to it and I'd listen to it because people who worked in real radio were telling me like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter the politics. The guy's really good at what he does. Listen to how he does it. And I became fascinated with that. And so right-wing media and CNN and MSNBC, that's where it becomes sort of fascinating. And it gives us a little agency, a little bit of media literacy, that I think we as writers are, we come to that with some advantages.
I guess for me, you know, when I was in a car the other day and like NPR came on, and I was like, what is that? That sounds so weird. Who are these people talking like there's not something terrible
Yeah,
happening
yeah,
and
yeah,
we're not in a terrible disaster and the world's all fine and it's dulcet tone. And so for me, at least listening to MeidasTouch with their big yellow headlines and say,
yeah,
Trump's a maniac, I'm like, at least they sound like the world that I'm living in or feel like I'm living in,
yeah.
instead of feeling terminally divorced from it, I guess. That's the one thing that I would say in favor of them.
The dulcet tone. I think maybe in the future there'll be a history of this period and the dulcet tone and how media did ignore, so much of this. And versus what's that famous book about the 1890s, the Mauve decade, and, the Gilded Age as out in the countryside, a book I wrote about in my book, Wisconsin Death Trip, things were falling apart very, very rapidly. Yeah, I guess I'm sort of saying the Blair the blaring tone of MeidasTouch or that kind of rhetoric is more to the moment than NPR. And I think there's all sorts of reasons NPR, New York Times, and a lot of sort of elite legacy media, it's just ill-equipped by uh, by history of American journalism to address this, to call someone a fascist, not as like a you are beyond the pale, as that Washington Post columnist I mentioned kept on saying, you're saying beyond the pale. I'm not saying beyond the pale. I'm saying it's a good third or more of the electorate. That's not beyond the pale. That's here. We have to deal with it. But the blaring headline, doesn't that do like this says Trump's a maniac and so on. It supposes that we still occupy the center, right? And that we still have the power to define him back into the darkness. Whereas, and I kind of make this point often when it kind of because it's the only kind of media I get to be present at, is that, they're not the fringe. We are. This podcast is the fringe. We're the fringe, but
No
Tucker
doubt.
Carlson, that's the mainstream, right? See, New York Times is not the mainstream. Um, uh, and I think so. I think the blaring headlines. I want that urgency, but I want it wed to reporting and thinking and history and context and the aware that to move it from this idea that we're in a crisis. It's a crisis. It's a crisis. A crisis is one narrative frame, and it supposes a certain kind of resolution for good or ill, right? I think of this in terms, I begin the book. It's not a crisis, it's our condition. We don't have a crisis of democracy. We have a condition in the same way that we don't have a climate crisis. Because you know what? What are we going to do? The glaciers are falling apart. How can we put them back together again? We can't. This is what we live with. What are we going to do? Democracy's in trouble. We'll never go back to a history of peaceful transition. That's gone. That's over. So the condition, and look, we were talking before this. I live with a heart condition. The doctor tells you have a heart condition. That's no reassurance narrative. That's not the dulcet tone. That's, oh, I'm going to have to live with this. I'm going to have to make these changes. This is what democracy is. This is the full presence of more fully formed fascism than we quite had before. We have to live with that. What do we do about that? What choices do we make? Choices that go beyond November, choices that go beyond national politics, choices that bring us into our cultural lives, our political lives, our sports lives, everything, right? That's what I want us to try and find in our media.
So as I'm listening to you talk, I think about what's going on in my own house, where my husband is frequently a person who's listening to right-wing media, kind of, he's like, what are they saying? What are they keeping tabs? And I kind of can't do it, but I recognize in that, like, that there's one version of that that's cowardice, and there's another version of that that's like self-protection. I think about, you're mentioning your heart condition. Like, I definitely am a person with like certain physical manifestations of anxiety and stress that are starting to like really take their toll. And, I want to do this work for a long time. I want to be a writer and reporter who engages with politics. So I'm kind of interested broadly in how you think about sustaining a writing life in engagement with these kinds of politics, and sort of specifically in relation to this book, right? You've been writing about this country's like slow political shift. The original question said decline, and in deference to your point about condition, I'm saying shift, longer and more broadly, and also in a lot more detail. Some people have called it anthropological than a lot of other writers. I like that even the title is a kind of insistence on telling the truth, like being with reality as it actually is. So I wonder if you can talk about how you began the project, about that framing, and also about like how you keep going.
Well, first I should say I'm totally sympathetic to, not being able to listen to this stuff. And I kind of think that's where we think of solidarity movements, right? Like we each have different callings. And I go through phases of this. I kind of have a writing career where I write one book that kind of deals with some of this, and then I'm like, all right, I'm done. I paid my dues. I've done my bit. And then I write another book that doesn't. And I think I'm never going to come back to this stuff. And certainly with the Undertow, I really thought I was not going to come back to this. And for me, it had much more to do with two young kids, one of whom is trans, and trying and who, I don't shelter them a whole lot. And even I kind of like, this is my parenting 2 cents is if you think you're sheltering your kids, you're fooling yourselves. And I teach creative nonfiction in college, so the kids come and write about what they know. They know what's going on, right? So I wanted to sort of say, well, how can I give them hope that's not, cheap grace, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the anti-fascist theologian, put it, right? And so the book was an attempt to do that, and in that sense to kind of steer into the curve, right? Like, if you're driving on snow and you start to slide, your instinct is to go the other way, and in fact you steer into the curve and you look at the thing, and
Well, let's
and I
do
think
that. We want you to read.
all right, okay. So this passage here is this was a Trump rally in 2020. And I think this one was yes, this is in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which calls itself the sweetest place on earth. And the streetlights are shaped like Hershey chocolate drops. And Trump was doing part of his performance, talking about the media. Journalists were the true enemy within. Illegals and the mind's eye of the believers were easily identifiable by color and implicitly subhuman and thus unable to truly plot America's destruction. They were not the enemy itself, but rather its pawns, the hordes that the media ushered toward our borders. But even though the media may be on our televisions, it was not always easy to see. The enemy was cunning. It attempted to blend. It always had. In Tsarist Russia and Nazi Germany, it was the Jews. In Cold War America, it was communists. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the American right rallied for a while around hating the gays. All had in common the ability to pass. Now it was the journalists. They moved among us unseen. Your own child could become one. So it was in Hershey, where I, a writer, a Jew no less, got my ticket and entered with a crowd, and finally, at last, donned the red hat. So many around me were wearing camouflage, why shouldn't I? In part, it was a practical decision, made in the parking lot after hours in line. It was cold and it was raining, and I am bald. When a vendor came by pushing a cart, I forked over $20. It also felt prudent. The crowd in Hershey, self-declared sweetest place on earth, where the streetlights are shaped like giant Hershey's kisses, felt meaner than in Louisiana or Florida. There seemed to be fewer families and more knots of young men chanting Trump, 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 punctuating the name with raised fists. Inside, I found a spot not far from the stage. Sometimes Trump rambled. Sometimes he owned the crowd. When Trump was on, he worked his hands like a bellows in and out, counting the lies, the deceptions, each instance of disrespect to Trump projected onto the lives of his followers, conflated with all the personal wrongs they had suffered. He spoke for them. Through him, they became him. Each man and woman remade as Trump, Trump, Trump. They spied on our campaign. Who spied? Who didn't matter. It was the verb that counted. Spied. They hid it so nobody could see it. Hid what? What didn't matter? It was the verb, hid, and the response. Trump spreading his hands wide. Trump, Trump, Trump. Don't be fooled by his fractured syntax. His sentences were not so much broken as syncretic, fusing with the thoughts of his followers. There was comedy, the Lisa Page routine about an FBI agent who had an affair with another FBI agent, which Trump performs both parts, culminating in him on stage acting out what he imagines as an orgasm. A full skit about windmills that is verbatim text from one performance given line breaks could almost be read as a bad Gnostic poem. Tremendous fumes, gases are spewing into the atmosphere. You know, we have a world, right? The world is tiny compared to the universe. So tremendous, tremendous amount of fumes. There were numbers, 131 records, 182 judges, 1/8 of an inch, 250 years, 160,000 new jobs. What did these numbers mean? Trump. The numbers were Trump numbers, good numbers, the best numbers, just as the enemies were Trump enemies, bad enemies, the worst enemies. Say it, Trump growled, as if he were holding one by the throat, choking a confession out of him. Say it, you crooked bastard. The crowd screamed. Say what? Crooked bastard. I'd like to force him to say it. The crowd wanted to watch. Trump's timing, so puzzling to those who expect somber gravitas, was that of a Borscht Belt comedian. Only he tweaked the Jewish comic formula of funny because it's sad, sad because it's funny. With Trump, it was funny because it was mean. Time for a joke. Again with numbers. 5 years, Trump said. He paused, smirked, letting the crowd fill it in. It was their joke, too. 9 years, 13 years, 17 years, 21 years, 25 years, 29 years. Then the punchline, when I leave office. The crowd roared. Now, Trump said, pointing to his cage full of reporters, I'm only doing that to drive them totally crazy. That drives them crazy, even joking about it. Joking. I don't know. Should we give it a shot? Maybe we'll give it a shot. Maybe. I'm only kidding. Media, I'm only kidding. Not joking. It worked. His joke would be the only part of the rally that made the evening news, none of the violent dream that followed. If Trump said it was a joke, reporters reported that claim. They wanted to believe that some norms still held. Some feared that if they acknowledged just how far beyond norms he'd gone, they'd be normalizing the new American spectrum, one in which dictatorship had become not just a hyperbolic charge thrown around by each party's most heated partisans, but an actual idea, a joke, or maybe a possibility, sooner rather than later.
Jeff, thank you so much. I feel like that close reading of everything that those details mean and don't mean is really helpful to me. I feel like a little bit later in the book, you write, the media of which Trump approved didn't just parrot his words, it laundered them, which is another quote that I found kind of helpful. And so we've been talking about how even the media Trump doesn't approve of has been, quote, laundering his words, if we're not going to use the word sanewashing. But I'm curious about how things kind of work on this other end. And you consumed, as we've been discussing, a lot of conservative media to write this book, and you talk about that in the book itself. Can you say a little bit more about that part of your research and how you are, if you're still listening, how things are going in that neck of the woods?
Yeah, I'm still listening. Just today, I saw a Twitter account with 1.2 million followers take the JD Vance story, which is that the reason there's not enough government help in Western North Carolina because of migrants. And this massive account took it one step further. This, I guess, getting uptake and sort of saying, they've gone through FEMA and discovered that all FEMA's directors, so they say, and I doubt this is true, are Jewish. And so it is the Jews you know, it's a little bit like all conspiracy true theories are true at once. And when I think media launders, whether it's, you know, old establishment media doing so because, as I say, they don't want this fascism to be possible, or it's Laura Ingraham doing sort of the both and, right? This idea that Trump has policy ideas. He doesn't have policy ideas. Nobody wants him to have policy ideas. Nobody goes to the rally and saying, I was disappointed I didn't hear more policy. No, they go and they say, I like that part where he was talking about decapitations. That was a good part, right? Um, and it's interesting that both the right-wing media and the sort of the centrist media, neither reports on the decapitation monologue, the disembowel. I mean, he talks a lot. There's a lot of very violent rhetoric. There's a lot of talking about rape. It's pornographic and horrific and so on. And I think that's the laundering, one for the sake of imagining this threat isn't here, and one for allowing you to both have your cake and eat it too, to have the violence and imagine yourself the new normal.
Well, I really appreciated the book for that exact reason. I mean, there are many stories in there and things that in all this time I've never heard reported about Trump saying, you know, just the story that you talk about, he tells about General Pershing murdering Muslims in the Philippines, right? I'd never heard that before. And maybe I'm not consuming the right media, but it was
No, that
important,
wasn't,
you know?
that's a perfect example because that wouldn't be reported by the New York Times. That's like, oh, that's just outlandish and not true. So who cares?
It's the
What did he
most
say
important
about
stuff.
policy? And it wouldn't be reported by the official sort of right-wing media because they're sort of saying, yeah, you can support him because of policy. But if you go into the murk, yeah, you can find it. I mean, as I travel around America, you can just stop in a bar and say, remember that time General Pershing dipped 50 bullets in pig's blood? I mean, not any bar, anywhere, anytime. You'll find these stories, these kind of folk tales, this kind of mythology as a sort of alternate politics that's there. And that's just to me, I mean, it's both we have to contend with it politically, but I admit, just also as a writer, like that's the interesting stuff. Those are the stories people are telling themselves in order to live, and they're terrifying stories. And let's hear them.
So we're recording on October 6th. And, you know, the election is not so far away. And we often like to end with a little crystal ball question. So I wanted to ask you your take on, you know, depending on what happens, however long after the actual election we come to a conclusion about what has occurred, how will the news landscape and this reporting problem that we're talking about today change? Right? If Kamala Harris wins, what's the future of American reporting?
So the good news, right? Kamala Harris wins, and we don't have, what I encounter in mega churches, this idea of we need a special Guantanamo for journalists, right? Which I don't think Trump will do, but I do think there will be get ready IRS, get ready audits, get ready all the tools, get ready, and it will not be evenly distributed. I think it's going to be a worrisome time. But the reality is, 2024, we'll see when it's done and cleared, but it was predicted that a third of local daily papers would go out of business this year. An increasingly massive amount of America lives in a news desert, getting their news only from nationalized sources online, completely unaware of the threats. It's a little bit, for instance, the story that's fallen out of the news is school board takeovers, right? And the last time the national news paid attention to it, in fact, we saw a lot of school board takeover attempts fail. Well, yay, we won, except it's still happening. It's still happening. The difference is in so many places, we don't have a local paper to cover it. I talking to a friend, Pete Dominic, who's got a podcast and talks about this in Rockland County, north of New York, a full Trumpist takeover of the school board, viciously targeting trans kids, really monstrously. There's no real local media left to do anything about it. I'm lucky. We have a newspaper where I am, but it's a little bit of a shadow of its former self, and it can't really do the coverage we need in New Hampshire of the anti-trans initiatives and I want to say this, they're threatening trans people first, but I think there's a terrible mistake when we think about what the media is and what the media should do of imagining, oh, if you're not in that category that you see threatened, well, I'm gonna be an ally. I'm gonna stand in support of them. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of fascism. Fascism does not come in order. It does not tick off boxes. It will come for everybody, and it will come in a disorganized way. Um, so you need that local media, and I think let's go best case scenario. Harris wins and is able to take power. Two separate things. Um, then comes the really hard work of of rebuilding a media that has pretty much, it's like a honeybee's colony collapse. We've got to start from the ground up.
Jeff, thanks so much for joining us. Listeners, don't miss The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War, available at independent bookstores near you.
Thanks, Whitney. Thanks, Sugi.